Hello friends and family, welcome to Scout the Pages. My name is Scout, and today we are going to be exploring outside of our comfort zone by reading some poetry.
One day I feel alright, the next I'm looking for the light, for the light, for the light.
Some of you may know that I got a bachelor's degree in creative writing English from my university, and in that time I took many a poetry class, and poetry's never been something that really clicked with me until now. I've never been one to enjoy reading poetry. I like writing poetry more than reading it, although I never really was that big of a fan of writing it to begin with, but I think I have a suspicion that has changed since becoming a parent. So I want to explore in this video reading some poetry and making myself write some as well, experimenting with different mediums and different types of poetry. So come with me as I try to expand my comfort zone, give poetry another shot, and see if maybe I've been missing out on something this whole time that could have been a really productive and healthy outlet for myself. So before this video, over the summer, I read Courtney Peppernell's Watering the Soul. I have tried her books before and just really did not click with them. Something about them just did not vibe with me, which is perfectly valid. I know a lot of people love it, so I don't feel too bad saying that. I know that she has readership, but I picked this up on a whim over around July this year and really enjoyed it. I still had my nitpicks about it that I think are just quirks of Courtney Peppernell's style of poetry, and that's okay. I know not everything is going to be 100% love, but I enjoyed this so much more than I thought I would. I have tabs all over this. I wrote all over this with a pen. I did a lot of notes and tabbing because I really was feeling the emotions behind these. So for this video, I am going to be reading the next book that Courtney Peppernell did that's kind of in this series about the soul. This is The Way Back Home. So we're gonna give this one a go just because we've had success this year already with a previous book. And then we have Home by Whitney Hanson. I've been watching Whitney Hanson's Instagram videos for a long time, and it's the only spoken word poetry that I've consistently enjoyed. I love her page, I love the poems that she does, and I love the way she reads them. Not only is she a beautiful person, but she's a beautiful soul. So I thought, why would I not give this book a try? We're gonna start with this one for this video. I have my highlighter, my note-taking pen, I'm gonna get some tabs going, and we're gonna just really dive into this. I'm gonna binge these, so it should go pretty quickly. Good evening, siblings. I have just finished Whitney Hanson's Home. This book was not what I expected it to be, if I'm being completely honest. I have heard several of the poems within this book before, but I did not know the inspiration behind this book, or kind of the purpose, I guess. I had assumed that this book was going to be some kind of self-help, self-reflection book about belonging, and it is sort of that, but it is more so about finding oneself and one's place and belonging after breakups. This is very much a book about love and relationships and mourning a relationship, that transition between relationships, if that makes any sense. Personally, that's not something that I really think about much, nor do I feel is unhealed in myself. You know, I've obviously been in relationships that have ended and I have been the one who was hurt many times before, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I got to the extent that I think this book is intended for. I think that this book is excellent for someone who does struggle with the end of romantic relationships and puts a lot of their self-worth in other people. If that sounds like something that you or someone you know might need, this book would be an excellent journey to go on. For that reason, I would recommend this book in particular for those going through breakups or who have put too much of their self-worth and identity in others. With that said, I personally have not had that issue. I have never really been a person who depends on others. Call it trust issues, call it trauma, call it what you will, but I'm an extremely independent person. There were a lot of poems that were not something that I would personally call my experience, although I do see the value in this, if that makes any sense. Just because I haven't experienced it doesn't mean I haven't seen people and witnessed people around me experience this. I think this could be very healing for some people. I did go through and tab some things that I personally did agree with. The first 3/4 of the book were really hard for me because I wasn't relating to the struggle as much. There were a few parts that I did relate to, as in like feeling lost or having a lack of home. Ultimately, I am very far in my healing journey. I would say I've come a long way, and this book is more of an early healing journey situation. And I've noticed throughout reading this that I was basically only highlighting positive things and I think that's a great sign for my mental health and my journey. I think I've reached a point now where the things in this book that resonated with me were not the depressing parts, it was the parts of security and light and hope. So that's an interesting observation within myself, I think. So I did gain something from this. I will have to come back to you for my final thoughts though. I'm going to sit on this for the next few days. Okay, siblings, I have done some thinking and I think I kind of have my final conclusions here on Home by Whitney Hanson. I ended up giving this a 6.07 out of 10 on Cawpile, which ends up being 3 out of 5 stars. First, I'll say the thing that I liked about this book is that it makes poetry very accessible and approachable. It also makes you kind of, as the reader, feel like you could write poetry yourself, because to be honest, there's not much going on in these poems that's super difficult, or at least seemingly difficult. They are pretty rudimentary, elementary even, and I think that makes them accessible, which is a positive thing, but I think it also makes them approachable as someone who may not be super familiar or fond of poetry would find this easy to read, digest, and maybe even replicate. This book definitely feels like Whitney Hanson processing her own feelings. It feels very stream of consciousness, which personally for me isn't my favorite. I don't feel like each of these poems was meditated on that intensely. That brings us to the things that I have criticisms about, or things that I just didn't prefer myself. My main criticism would be that 80% of this book felt like filler content. There were poems that were literally only 1 line long, and there were a lot of those, which was very surprising to me, saying that this book is huge. For example, I ended up highlighting a little bit of something on most pages, but this book is extremely repetitive and 80% of it feels like filler. So I feel like this book could have been shortened significantly down to 20% of its size. And the 20% of those poems that I did feel like had significant craft and style and lots of premeditation put into them were really good. And I think that if the book was only those poems, it would have been more worth the money. I think what's happening here is this was $18 and I felt like 80% of it was filler and I'm not a fan of that. It was very repetitive and stream of consciousness and just kind of random phrases and thoughts that didn't feel extremely poetic. Not that poetry needs to be super pretentious or anything like that. I'm just saying it didn't feel like Whitney Hanson put a ton of her craft and time into each poem. It kind of felt like a diary, and in a like undrafted way, in an unedited way. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think there are going to be people who don't mind that at all and actually prefer that for its accessibility. But I personally want a little more from my poetry. My cat is jumping around. Ultimately, I would land on, I think this is great for an audience of young adult and new adult. It does read angsty, and I think that's going to relate to a lot of younger people. My next minor criticism, which would be just a personal thing, is that it's very melancholic. The first 3/4 of the book feel extremely down, melancholic, depressing, and lost, while that last quarter was where the hope was. And even then, there were these repeated phrases of feeling broken and lost and like you'll never have home again. I love that it's a vent. Love that for the author. Truly, the poet should definitely get that off their chest. Absolutely. As a reader, I would like to feel like my works were more curated towards hope overall. I just wished that more time and craft was spent on the other 80% of this book. That's really where I fall here. Is I really loved that 20% of the poems. I know there was a lot of time spent on like publishing the book and getting it ready. I think we should have gone with quality over quantity here. So those are my thoughts on Home by Whitney Hanson. I was disappointed, but also found some things that I did really enjoy about it. We're gonna just sit on a 3 stars for this. It's solid. I will go recommending this to people whom I feel like will connect with the messages and relate to the angst. I would not call this my favorite poetry collection ever. I still think Watering the Soul is higher on my list than this one. I can see many people really connecting with this though, and that is, you know, that's been proven in Whitney Hanson's massive following on TikTok and Instagram. Yeah, those are my thoughts on Home. I did write a poem inspired by Whitney Hanson, so I'm gonna read it to you. I took inspiration from Whitney Hanson's poem from a different collection of hers, and the poem is called Hand Me Down Grief. I saw this poem on Instagram. She read it in her videos and I was moved by it, truly. I've definitely been in that position, that mindset, where I felt like I was carrying a grief that wasn't my own. And I have my moments, trust me. I'm no saint or anything. I'm not perfect. But I find that it was a little too down for me at the moment of my life that I'm currently in. You know, in this healing era for me, I'm feeling more uplifting and hopeful and strong than I am down and depressed and grieving something that I didn't get out of my life. I remixed it to be my own, and I'm gonna share it with you. All credit to Whitney Hanson for the idea, for the structure. I just remixed it with some of my words from my perspective, completely flipped the poem on its head to be the opposite of what it was. I'm gonna read it to you now. I'm not gonna be as eloquent as Whitney Hanson. I don't generally do spoken word poetry, let alone talking to myself in a room at a camera. Thank you for being kind to me in the comments. Mine is called Hand Me Down Resiliency. I think I've been fierce for longer than I've been alive, and I know that sounds strange, but let me explain. All we are is energy passed from one form of life to the next, and before I became myself, I was something else instead. I was the roots of a sequoia tree or a boat upon a stormy sea. I was the first ray of sun breaching a cloudy sky. I was a forceful breeze. I was the relentless pull of the moon on the tide. I was I will whispered or roared into the night. From the start, my soul has been fighting in a war that didn't start with me. I'm convinced that some people come into this world carrying hand-me-down resiliency. Again, I don't think there was anything wrong with Whitney's original poem, Hand Me Down Grief. I do think it's a very valid place to be in. I just wanted to reflect my own current experience in a poem in a similar style because I thought it was just so brilliant. And that continues to prove my point that about 20% of this book was really good and I was really moved. Those poems hit so hard. I felt the passion and the craft in them. I just didn't feel it in the other 80%, which is where I would say the book kind of falls short. I did write a poem back when I was pregnant, before I discovered Whitney Hanson, that I think kind of fits her vibe. I wrote it back when I was just feeling super poetic, but also super angry and down while I was creating a life of my own. I wanted to read it to you. It's a little personal, but it's not too personal, I would say. So I'm going to read it to you, and then I have a third poem that I wrote recently, actually, within the last few months. That is kind of my dabble in poetry for this video, and then we will move into The Way Back Home by Courtney Peppernell. I'm very hopeful for this. This poem I wrote back when I was pregnant is called Feminine Skeleton. How can I eat when I'm already full? My skeleton can't hold onto the weight of carrying this invisible pain, but is it invisible? For all it takes is a glance at the angles and lines, the thin hair and headlight eyes, a young mind who knew the wisdom that comes with shouldering a broken system. Maybe they weren't looking for the bags beneath red eyes or the shirts that hung like a sign that screamed, "Don't look at my frame," because the curve of a thigh or the weight on her chest in something too feminine is the crime to those who have an eye for children comfortably dressed. It's an eating disorder, they said, choosing not to see the plates she downed with the hope that love would stick around her thighs and her waist, because boys don't like skeletons. They want to feel your weight, something to grab onto, something to take. You're lucky, they say, not knowing the addiction that haunts her DNA. Never do this, never do that. From as little as 3 substances are not for me. I didn't choose to be born addicted to their drugs, afraid to slip a sip, obsessively making sure I don't depend on anything or anyone. I don't like to dwell on the past. I really don't. And I don't want people to see me for my past that was out of my control entirely. It's not my fault the way that adults treated me as a child. And I want everyone to know that. It is not your fault for the way that you were or the things that you experienced, and you are not defined by the things that people did to you. I just want to make that clear before I say that, you know, the inspiration behind this poem was that I am small. I'm kind of a tiny human, and I always have been. And that is because of extreme neglect as an infant before I was adopted. You know, against all odds, I survived the neglect and I was adopted out, and since then I've just been really tiny, and my whole life I was bullied by the adults around me, professionals, family, about my weight and how skinny and how thin I was. And I ate like 3 times the amount all of my friends ate who were twice my size. It wasn't a matter of starving myself. It wasn't an eating disorder. And it was really harmful my entire childhood to hear that I was accused of having a disorder that I didn't have, and there were people really struggling with that. What I was struggling with was a really intense metabolism that I didn't choose because of the way that I was treated in my very, very, very early development as a literal infant. Sorry, my cat is not being respectful of me being genuine and vulnerable right now on the internet. That was my extremely vulnerable poem. Let me know if you relate to any of it in the comments. I wrote a poem this year actually that I intended to be quite hopeful. I don't know that it turned out that way, but I call it Antonym of Love. In ominous tones they'd caution, just wait and see, you'll learn the truth from atop your own family tree. But as a parent now, I've known a different pain. Your way's a puzzle I can't quite explain. Your love was missing, far from unconditional. Expectations like looking into a loaded pistol. I've chosen a path where a gentle hand takes its place, guiding my child with love and unquestioning grace. I light my heart on fire to keep hers warm. I whisper I love you into the eye of her storm, nurturing each version of her every morning anew, a narrative of love, an antonym to you. I wrote this poem this year actually, and it's basically about the struggle of having narcissistic and even abusive parents and raising your own child after that and breaking that cycle of toxic and hurt. You know, those cycles of abuse are handed down generation to generation, so the ones who need to undo those cycles, those cycle breakers, go through a lot, and it's really hard. It makes parenting just 10 times harder to have to undo everything that you learned and everything that was taught to you about how children should be treated. So I wrote this poem as a promise to my child that I will always choose her, and I will always do what's best for her, and I will always love her and never be a synonym to the people who raised me. Okay friends, so I have finished both of these books now. I finished The Way Back Home by Courtney Peppernell. I have sat on my thoughts about this, and let me get the other one to talk about both at the same time. So I read Watering the Soul over the summer, and then I read The Way Back Home for this video. And I have to say, I liked Watering the Soul more overall. I think I got more from it, and I think the theme and genre of this entire book really aligned with me personally. Now, The Way Back Home is about the pandemic, surprisingly. It's about the 2020 pandemic and how everyone kind of lost this sense of home and security and safety. And it's really majoritively about being torn apart from loved ones, romantic and family at the same time. I enjoyed it. Again, I don't really feel like I relate to both of the messages in this. That's like breakups and lacking identity because of romantic partners and putting yourself into your relationship and not having a healthy line between you and your partner. It's relatable, and I completely understand the message, absolutely, and I think it's a very important thing. Just for me personally, as a married person and a very independent person my entire life because of my avoidant attachment style, I am not completely moved by these because of that. I will say the last quarter of the book that starts on Find Love, I started relating to it a lot more at this point in the journey that you go on to find home, because it starts talking about finding love and having purpose and all of these things. So I found myself actually tabbing a lot in this second half of the book. I'd say that's still a win. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. I also gave Home 3 out of 5 stars. I will put my final rankings up here as I talk about each book so you can see the content warnings, the messages, and my overall thoughts and who I think the book would be for. In comparing these two, I would say this one more consistently was relevant to my journey as an individual, but they are equal in quality and style. Obviously, they're kind of part of a little set where there's this style that Courtney Peppernell is trying out, because you know, they got these little creatures on them. I think it's kind of like a series unofficially. I really enjoyed these a lot more than I enjoyed Whitney Hanson's poetry and writing, is what I'll say. To be fair, this is more of a spoken word thing. You can tell that this was written for Whitney to read out loud on the internet, because they do not read on paper super well. I don't think they have a good rhythm. I don't think they have a good flow. They don't feel like poetry. It feels like stream of consciousness, which again is not a problem. I just personally don't really click with that kind of poetry for reading with my eyeballs. I love Whitney Hanson's spoken word poetry. I will continue to watch her videos on Instagram. I will continue to enjoy them and share them and be inspired by them. This book was very inspiring, but again, I don't think that this is the best format for this. So if you were considering this book, I would say Buy it if you want to support Whitney Hanson because you enjoy her poetry. I would not recommend buying it for your collection as poetry in and of itself. I would see the spoken word version of this because Whitney Hanson's delivery makes this the poetry that it is. These, on the other hand, I think are really great. They're, again, about 50% of the poems felt stream of consciousness, and the other 50% felt actually like thoughtful poetry with decent prose, syntax, and meter. The difference between these two, though, that I think is very important to point out here is that Watering the Soul is standard poetry. It's quick little bitties, right? They're quick reads, but they hold a lot of meaning and a lot of impact, okay? This one, the only like real complaint I would have is there are a lot of massive pages that don't feel like poetry. They feel like essays. This very much felt like a self-help book. Truly, all of these felt like self-help. It didn't feel super poetic. These are more pretentious poetic than this would be, but the personal essay style for this and stream of consciousness, huge pages of text. There were just too many of them. Too many. I don't want my poetry to be an essay, personally. I feel like less is more. I want more thoughtful, short poems that hold a lot of impact than I do large poems. Like, I can literally just open this and you'll see that one's short, but like 50% of the poems are massive. So this one took twice as long to read as this one, and not in a good way. Not in a they're short and they had so much meaning that I just sat and dwelled on them. It's more, there's just so many words, and I think it's too many. This one needs refining. This one is great. I'd recommend this one for a personal journey. This is less about relationships, breakups, and identity in that way, and it's more about personal identity. I really enjoy Courtney Peppernell's style in these books of the journey. There's sections that you go through on this timeline of a journey to healing your soul. I enjoy that. This one, again, it was hit or miss depending on the poem. I wasn't a huge fan that finding home depended on other people, and I found myself highlighting sections and feeling like I could reword them in a way that was more healthy for an individual. I would say what I've learned from this video is that I don't like self-help poetry. It's not for me. I really like nature-themed poetry. I really like short, impactful poetry that is extremely thoughtful and efficient and concise. I am really big into the metaphors. I really like using a nature story or some kind of analogy to represent something else, to be a more indirect message through comparison, I guess. I definitely will say that I will be reading more Courtney Peppernell going forward, but I have tried her backlog before and it is not for me. I did not like Pillow Thoughts or any of that. I feel like these get really depressing to start because they're kind of this journey that you're going on, and I think that could be really triggering for some people. I'm still not huge into reading poetry, but I am into spoken word. I will continue to watch it. I am going to continue to try writing it because it is therapeutic for me for some reason. As a mother in my mid to late 20s, poetry has finally found its way into my self-care journey. I probably will not be buying any more of these books ever again. I've got 3 now. That's more than enough. I will be referencing these again in the future if I feel the need to read some poetry, but I think I'm gonna stick to collections and using the internet for my poetry because this was not a cheap video. You know, this book was $17, this one was $17, and this one was $18. That's kind of a lot for what I would consider a 3-star set of books that I didn't really gain much from, that I couldn't have gained from just watching spoken word or reading these online. That's where I'm at with these. I did enjoy annotating them. They were inspiring. They did inspire me to write my own poetry, as you saw earlier, but ultimately, I think I've done my due diligence to give this a shot. I will definitely be doing a part 2 in the future where I will be reading poetry books suggested to me by you. So if you have any poetry books that you think would be more up my alley than these self-help ones, please comment them down below. It can be a single poem that you found online, it can be a collection that you have or you've written yourself. I am very interested in expanding my comfort zone and continuing to try. I'm not going to write off poetry permanently. I've just learned that maybe these self-help style ones aren't for me. I could write them myself and that would be more impactful on me than reading somebody else's words. Let me know down below your suggestions. I will make a part 2 at some point next year in 2024 where I read your poetry suggestions or your poetry even. Also, let me know down below what your favorite poems are, or if you like poetry at all. If you've made it to this point in the video, comment down below. Do you like poetry? Do you not like poetry? Have you never even tried poetry? What's your favorite poem? And if you've read any of these, obviously please let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Stay safe and stay kind, siblings.